Hey guys, my name is Jay, and I love comic books. More specifically, I love superhero comics. While I didn't grow up going to the local comic book store at the end of the week, I did, like most people, grow up watching the animated shows part of the DCAU and systemically watching comic book movies as soon as they hit the cinemas. Hell, the first movie I've ever watched in theaters was Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, and the memory of seeing it for the first time is probably my only glimmer of childhood innocence that I still cling onto. I spent many nights staying up late just so I could watch episodes of Justice League Unlimited, and reruns of WB's Golden Goose, Batman the Animated Series on Toonami. My family was generally wealthier than most people in our community, and there came a time where I planned to secretly renovate the attic of my childhood home into a mini Batcave and prowl the streets of my neighborhood as a 7-year-old Batman. But unfortunately, my parents were never tragically murdered, and I ended up growing a relatively normal, only slightly less depressed life than my idol billionaire who dressed up like a giant rodent. Mom, Dad, if you're watching, that was a joke. You know I love you guys. Bye. Back to the point. I love superhero stories. I adored them. And up to this day, they are one of, if not my number one passion. Here's a picture of me on my 7th birthday, and here's one of me now. I'm writing this essay, and yet I can't even express on a literate level how much I love superhero stories. In fact, I am way too passionate and driven to obsession by this genre that I honestly think I need professional help. But you don't care about me right now. Right now, you are either a passionate nerd like me, curious to hear my thoughts on this iconic genre, or an even more overly passionate fan of dark and gritty comic book stories, probably thinking, dude, just get on with the video so I can express my hate in the comments. Or maybe you're just doing that right now without even watching the video. If you are a fan of superhero stories, or just a human being that hasn't lived in a fallout shelter for the past 10 or 20 years, you've probably noticed that superheroes, or comic book adaptations, have primarily dominated movies and TV shows. Whether that be with the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its large cultural following, or the never-ending milking and oversaturation of Batman in pretty much everything DC decides to do. No one can deny that these stories that were once considered campy or childish have made a stupendous impact on pop culture and the future of the comic book industry as a whole. But even more recently, I noticed that the genre has started to drift towards a particular direction and a particular audience. Ever since the release and the outstanding hit of The Dark Knight, there has been a slowly but surely growing wave of dark and gritty superhero stories, at least in movies and TV. In the comics, these stories had already reached a point where writers had decided to try and branch out, creating more adult-oriented stories, but we'll get into that later. In the year 2008, Warner Bros. Was planning to reboot the Superman franchise and even took pitches from some of the most iconic comic book writers at the time. Grant Morrison, who I love by the way, said this: "I told him it's not that bad. Just treat Superman Returns as the Ang Lee Hulk. The Incredible Hulk has proven the audience will forgive you and let you redo the franchise." A bunch of writers pitched other ideas, but in the end, the final verdict triumphed in the form of David Goyer and Christopher Nolan during a conversation regarding The Dark Knight Rises. Now, I don't know exactly how the discussion went down between these two, but eventually WB decided to hire Nolan and Goyer. Fast forward to a few years later, WB was in search of a director. From Del Toro to Zemeckis, a few others were considered, such as Affleck, who would eventually portray Batman in future installments, and Aronofsky, who was supposed to direct Batman Year One, but that project never saw the light of day. Eventually, as a birthday gift to me, news came out that they had just hired Zack Snyder as the director. This was great for me at the time because I did not hate the Watchmen movie until later in my life. So with all this great people involved and all the consultations from such iconic comic book writers, we fast forward to 2013. Man of Steel is set to release, popcorn on my lap, and then... it was okay. I thought it was pretty good. While this film had a widely divisive reception from fans, I thought it wasn't that bad. Sure, this wasn't the traditional Superman that I loved, but I found the movie to be decent and a good starting off point for the more hopeful Son of Krypton. Sure, it was darker than a Superman story is supposed to be, but it had a pretty good story, and it's not like it could get any worse. Right? It's not like it could get any worse. I hate Batman v Superman. Now, this isn't a review, but I will say that I felt broken walking out of that theater. Everything about what I had just seen felt so wrong on every level, slowly stabbing and killing my nerdy little comic book heart. This movie was so incomprehensible on a narrative standpoint, so pretentious and so unnecessarily grim that it was like the 90s and early 2000s comic books just jumped onto the screen. It's like Ennis, Miller, McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, and his feet were thrown into a blender together. It's like the entire production crew read The Dark Knight Returns and missed the entire fucking point of the story. The entire thing was so devoid of logic, so unnecessary, like Rob Liefeld and his feet, that it actually hurt me. But there was one thing that hurt me most about this movie, and I'm going to get back to that later. A few seconds ago, I mentioned Rob Liefeld, and speaking of Rob Liefeld and his feet, we zoomed to 2016. Wade Wilson, the crimson comedian, the merc with the mouth, made his first film debut. Yes, I said first. Deadpool's movie made over a total of $783.1 million with a budget of $58 million. $58 million. The film broke a number of records with its weekend opening and even became the highest grossing X-Men film, despite not being an X-Men film. People loved it. People praised it. People commended its R rating as if 2010's Kick-Ass didn't exist. A year later, Logan came out, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And just 2 years ago, Joker was released, shrouded with a great deal of controversy. Superhero movies were starting to grow edgier, and the best ones were starting to be made for a more mature audience. And it wasn't just the movies. Just a few years back, Marvel created their magnum opus of television in the form of Netflix's Daredevil. It was followed by a few good spin-offs with the exception of This Idiot, and another show with a version of Frank Miller, a version of Frank Castle the general audience could actually sympathize with. Umbrella Academy, Preacher, HBO's Watchmen, Jupiter's Legacy, Harley Quinn, and The Love of My Life in television format better known as Doom Patrol further strengthened the general public's interest in darker and more grounded comic book adaptations. But in my opinion, superhero television would ultimately be the rise and what would be the fall of the genre. In 2019, LexCorp released The Boys on LexCorp Prime Video. If you're unfamiliar or just don't care about this smash hit, The Boys is an adaptation of Garth Ennis's and Derek Robertson's, let's say, questionable comic book series from 2006 to 2012. The show, while guising itself as a superhero story, actually satirizes the genre, portraying superheroes as celebrities monetized by VOT International. But unbeknownst to the public eye, these quote-unquote superheroes are actually shown to be ruthless, egotistical, and corrupt individuals. The show makes it very clear that it is lampooning Hollywood celebrities and the image that they feign to their fans and the rest of the world. I really like this show, and I personally wasn't a big fan of the original work by Ennis, despite being a fan of some of his other work like Preacher and Crossed, but in all honesty, the show is not a superhero story. The Boys is a deconstruction of superheroes and our modern day superhero passion. Sort of, not really. It's a story about corporate colonialism, racism, politics, consumerism, and how massive corporations don't really care about the LGBT community and that all these pride brandings are just for show and money making. I love Maeve's arc, and maybe in the future I'll elaborate on that. As a former anarchistic punk rock kid, I love this show and its messages, but I never saw it as a superhero show. It didn't have the hopeful cape figure swooping down to save people for genuinely good reasons. It didn't have the colorful and wacky stories that made you think you were on LSD. It was a show that made you feel human. A show that told us that compared to these godlike figures, we aren't. I loved Invincible from the first moment I read it. And when I learned that Lex Luthor was having it adapted onto Prime Video, I was pretty excited. I wasn't really freaking out because by this time, the comic book had run its course and it had already been a few years and I was pretty much over it. But all in all, I was still pretty hyped. When the show came out, everyone and their mother fell in love with it. It was gruesome, yet quite pleasant. It got pretty dark at times, but still somewhat lighthearted. Moments of absolute pure evil, yet at its core, extremely wholesome. Robert Kirkman, I love you, please adopt me. This show was actually a superhero show, or at least had enough similar themes to qualify as one. But it was after the first season had ended that I started to realize the problem with an overabundance of R-rated superhero stories. But we'll get into that later. Let's talk comics. Now, I'm not a comic book expert. Actually, no, I spend most of my time reading and writing. Gotta do something if I want to be editor-in-chief of DC Comics. But I have a wide enough knowledge of comic books and comic book history to tell you guys about the shift in tone in the industry. Batman was dark, we all know that. So dark that he murdered people when he first appeared. In those early days, he was less hero and more shadow dressed up like a bat. But eventually he grew to become more of a children's character when Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson created Richard Grayson to be the Caped Crusader's sidekick. Yes, Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson. Fuck Bob Kane. For a long while, superhero stories were fun and campy, character-driven stories that kids would love and adults could read and say, oh yeah, that was pretty fun. But as the years went by, the superhero industry grew to cater to adult audiences. I'm going to skip over the whole horror decade with all the drama with Frederick Wertham because I'm focusing on superheroes here and not horror. Anyways, I could start off with Denny O'Neil's seminal run on Green Lantern and how he tackled racism, but I'm going to skip over to 1986 when superhero stories decided they could actually get dark. If you are a fan of Batman, then you've undoubtedly heard of Frank Miller. Miller wrote The Dark Knight Returns, which he also illustrated alongside Klaus Johnson and the colors of Lynn Varley. The Dark Knight Returns has been talked about to death, so I'm not going to linger too long on it. But the story was a hit and sold over 1 million copies. It's that good. Frank Miller, I love you, please adopt me. In the same year, Alan Moore released Watchmen. Watchmen has been regarded as one of the best superhero stories or superhero deconstruction stories ever made. But in my opinion, it's less of a superhero story and more of a character story. In my opinion, Alan Moore did create the greatest superhero deconstruction story of all time, but not in the form of Watchmen, but in Miracle Man. If you're not familiar, Miracle Man, or Marvel Man as he was originally called, was basically a Shazam knockoff, created after Fawcett Comics stopped publishing the old Captain Marvel comics over a legal dispute with DC Comics, or National Comics as it was called at the time. Moore's run on Miracle Man is by far my favorite superhero deconstruction story. Did I say that yet? I feel like I've already said that. I'm not going to explain the story here because I think you should read it yourself. However, even though this next portion has slight spoilers that doesn't really give away the plot, I do suggest skipping ahead to this timestamp until you've read the original story. Done? Miracle Man is Alan Moore's way of making an actual superhero story designed for adults, or what he perceived a Superman would be in the real world. It portrays them as godlike beings that have become so detached from humanity that they would see humans as ants. These superhumans wouldn't adhere to our laws, our needs. They would simply become above us. Actual gods. And yes, I know it's basically the same as Dr. Manhattan, but there's something about this self-contained story that gets me. Alan Moore, I love you, please adopt me. This depiction of superheroes is by far the greatest deconstruction story for superheroes, but that's exactly what it is. A deconstruction of the genre. You can't suggest Miracle Man to someone if it's going to be their first superhero story. You might not have an appreciation for it if you don't understand the superhero genre. In 1988, Moore created The Killing Joke with the help of Dave Gibbons and John Higgins. Widely considered the best Batman story of all time. This one-off story was so good that DC decided to implement it onto the main continuity. But The Killing Joke and Alan Moore were the reasons that the industry fell into the dark ages, and not for the better. The 90s was a weird time for comic books. I'm gonna try to get through this as fast as possible. Noseless Wolverine, Demonic Punisher, this terrible costume, this other terrible costume, the big two trying to be Image Comics. Oh, you like Batman? Boom, back broken. Here's an edgier Batman. Oh, you like Superman? Boom, dead. Here's an edgier Superman. Oh, you like Spider-Man? And let's not forget Rob Liefeld and his feet. Can we skip to the early 2000s? Yeah, we can do that, right? Now, we'd be here for ages if I talked about every edgy and stupid thing in the early 2000s. So, I'm just gonna talk about one story. One story that will lead to the answer. Why I think R-rated superhero stories will be the downfall of the genre. Let's talk about Identity Crisis. So I'm not going to tell you to read Identity Crisis because in all honesty you're either going to love it or hate it, and I don't wish for you to waste your time on something you might not enjoy. So I'm going to try and recap everything as simple as possible. The story starts and Ralph Dibny's like, yo, I love my wife. Then a few pages later he comes home to see his wife, Sue, and she's like dead, and he's like, no. So at the funeral, this specific group of heroes go up to Ralph, and I think it was like Green Arrow or something. We're like, yo dog, we all know who did this. Then Wally and Kyle show up and they're like, what you talking about, man? And like the other group's like, it was Dr. Light, man, he did this. And Wally's all like, nah dog, he's kind of stupid though. Then the group explained that one time Dr. Light broke in the watchtower and he sexually assaults Sue Dibny. Yeah. Excuse me, waiter, there seems to be some edgelord poop water on my colorful superhero story. Ah, yes, that wasn't originally part of our recipe, but it turns out most people enjoy it, so it's stuck. What the fuck? So, the same Justice League members show up, restraining Dr. Light. They all take a vote and decide to wipe his mind of this event. Someone's like, yo, what if he tries again? We gotta do something so he won't act like this in the future. And they decide to scramble Dr. Light's mind. Our superheroes, Zatanna, gave this man a fucking lobotomy. Okay, so back to present day. The group track down Dr. Light, they fight Deathstroke, because why not? Then Dr. Light remembers what they did to him. The bad guys escape, yada yada yada, Jean Loring is attacked, Ray saves her, Tim Drake's dad dies, and somehow it continues to get worse. It's revealed that Batman was part of the original group that stopped Dr. Light, and Wally's like, hey, furry man wouldn't allow this to happen. And then Oliver explains, Batman left the watchtower for some stuff. I don't know, I can't remember. He came back while Zatanna was doing the mind juju thing on Dr. Light's mind. And Bruce tries to stop them. Z freezes Bruce and takes another vote where they decide to erase Bruce's memory. So, I just want to pause again. Zatanna, one of Bruce Wayne's closest friends, and I mean closest friends. She was friends with Bruce before he was Batman, and she's all like, yeah, no, I don't see a problem with messing with his mind. I don't want to talk about Identity Crisis anymore. Long story short, Jean Loring was the killer. And it is this need to pander to a more adult audience that in my opinion will cause the downfall of the genre. All the dark, sanguine stories that are made in order to show the general public that superhero stories can be taken seriously. All the edginess of the 90s with its shoulder pads and Rob Liefeld's feet. The genre is deteriorating because the truth is, superhero stories are for kids. Yes, I said it. Superhero stories are generally aimed towards a younger audience. Now, allow me to explain. If you go back to the golden age of comics, read the classic first appearances of these iconic heroes, they were almost always geared for children. And if somehow you don't believe me, just look at Captain Marvel. No, not that one. No, not that one either. Yeah, that guy. During the 1940s, Captain Marvel was the most popular superhero. I mean, this guy was outselling Superman, the big daddy and godfather of superheroes. Captain Marvel was so popular that he was the first comic book superhero to ever be adapted into film, released 6 months before Fleischer's Superman. It is insane to think that there was a time that someone was more popular than Superman, but in actuality it made a lot of sense. And that was all thanks to Captain Marvel's alter ego. William Joseph Batson was a child who... That sounds kind of off. Billy Batson was a child who was given magical abilities by the wizard Shazam when he spoke the magic word of... Shazam! Already you could tell why Captain Marvel's comics were outselling the Man of Steel. He was a kid. Young readers could relate to the young Billy Batson more than a surviving son of a doomed planet. Captain Marvel is the ultimate child fantasy. Oh, but Jay, superhero comics were being sent to soldiers while they were deployed. Yeah, there was a war going on. Troops needed what little fun they had so they wouldn't lose their mind. I'm in the army and I can confirm that half of us would do anything to stay mentally stable. Yes, I know that Stan Lee once said this: comic books to me are fairy tales for grown-ups. And I love Stan Lee. He revolutionized the genre by creating characters that felt real, that had genuine emotion. He wrote superheroes that could be real people with real problems. And I love that he did that. They were stories that adults could genuinely enjoy, but children were still the target demographic. Most fantasy stories are for kids, but that doesn't mean adults can't find some sort of delight and satisfaction in them. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit as a children's book. George Lucas said that Star Wars is for kids, but still, we love these stories with a passion. Like I said, I grew up watching the DC animated universe, and I still go back to watching them. Because even though they were created for kids, they had mature themes that didn't go overboard to edgelord territory. But nowadays, most of the comic book shows are geared towards an older generation or a teen rating. Yes, we have actual kids shows based on comic books, but all the ongoing ones are Teen Titans Go, DC Superhero Girls, and Marvel Superhero Adventure. What the hell is this? I'm not judging the quality of these shows, but compare them to the number of mature ongoing shows. The Boys, Umbrella Academy, Harley Quinn, Doom Patrol, Swamp Thing, Watchmen if that ever gets a second season, Young Justice that ended up pulling a Samurai Jack and said fuck them kids, this pile of garbage, and of course... Now, I mentioned that I love Grant Morrison. My second favorite Batman story is A Serious House on a Serious Earth. But imagine if every story was like that now. Imagine an 8-year-old Jay reading this book for the first time. What the hell is this? The industry is starting to be overwhelmed with these stories tailored for adults, and I feel like in the future, R-rated stories are the only thing that will dominate the industry. And you might ask me, oh, is that so bad? Yes it is. Even Alan Moore regrets how dark The Killing Joke was. Look at Frank Miller. Yes, he wrote one of the greatest Batman stories of all time. 2, actually. But he's fallen into a pit so dark that he's become a parody of himself. I'm the goddamn Batman. Speaking of Miller's insane goddamn Batman, I mentioned that there was one thing that broke me after seeing Batman v Superman. Before me and my friends went in, I saw this kid. He was about the same age as me in this old Batman costume, and like me, he was dressed like the Caped Crusader. I could see the happiness in his eyes. He couldn't wait to see Batman for the first time in movies. But then the movie happened. As I walked out of the theater, I felt empty. But then I saw that same kid. His face was blank, eyes filled with confusion. He didn't know what had just happened. All he knows was that he saw a nonsensical story about an emo Superman, and a Batman so fragmented that he would just murder criminals without hesitation. Suddenly, I didn't feel so empty. That blank void inside me felt anger. Anger at Warner Brothers. I was the same age as this boy when I saw Batman Begins in theaters, but unlike him, I was inspired when I saw Batman Begins. I found my passion. We both entered the theater ecstatic like young Bruce Wayne, and left it broken. Okay, a little about me. I'm going to tell you a story that is extremely important to who I am today. If you are uncomfortable with touchy subjects, I would say skip ahead. I grew up in the Philippines. I lived nowhere near the capital, and that was the reason I couldn't collect comic books. I did, however, have a National Bookstore and fully booked. They did sell graphic novels, so I was thankful of that. However, the community in which I lived in was not as passionate about comic books and superheroes as I was, and it didn't help that I was suffering from social anxiety and depression. So I only had 2 friends that I could actually discuss these subjects of superheroes with. By the time I was a teenager, I was at a point where my mental health was not at its best, and the fact that I came from a wealthier family, I felt like I had no reason to feel this way, so I kept everything bottled up. Then one day, I bought a graphic novel that was said to be one of the best comic book stories of all time. All-Star Superman. By this time in my life, I had felt that I had outgrown Superman, reading darker stories such as Batman, Old Man Logan, and Cross. But everyone on the internet says All-Star Superman is a must-read, and hey, it's written by Grant Morrison, so sure. It ended up hooking me to the story, and I savored every panel of it. Then out of nowhere came the page. If you've read All-Star Superman, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. 5 panels, 4 speech bubbles, 1 big impact. This one page put the plot on hold for just a short moment, and it was worth it. First off, if you haven't read the book, what the hell is wrong with you? Second, this page where Clark goes to talk with a suicidal teen, this teen who dressed the way I did and felt the way I did, saved my life. Because it wasn't him swooping down to catch her. It was him telling her that things could always get better. I bawled my fucking eyes out. I curled in my bed as tears ran down my face. This fictional man, this fictional human man, had given me hope and comfort from something that I was too afraid to tell my friends and family. Later on, I went on the internet and found that many people had experienced what I had, and you know what? For once, I didn't feel alone. And that's why when I see so many adaptations of superheroes going dark, it pains me that a child won't see it and feel inspired. A whole generation of children won't grow up with a passion for superheroes the way so many of us did. And to me, that hurts. Oh fuck, I forgot to talk about Frederick Wortham. Actually, no, I don't really think he's really important to the story. He wrote a bunch of stuff about how comic books were ruining the innocent, seduction of the innocent. Go read his book. Actually, don't. He's full of shit. Actually, go read his book. Actually, don't. There's a bunch of videos explaining Frederick Wortham, so I don't know. Anyway, thanks for sticking to the end. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and if you like it, maybe I'll make some more. My name's Jay. Peace out, guys. Rob Liefeld at his feet.